The departure of an empath often leaves the people around them confused. Before that point, they were usually the one who understood, the one who tried to keep the relationship steady, the one willing to step back so things would not escalate further than necessary. Because of that, when they suddenly cut ties and do not return, many people assume that something dramatic must have happened at the very end. In reality, the decision rarely forms on the day everything falls apart. It develops much earlier, in ordinary moments of everyday life that almost no one pays attention to. Moments when they adjust their own emotions so that someone else can feel more comfortable. Moments when they clearly see what is happening in the relationship, yet still choose to carry the heavier part so that things do not collapse. Over time, a quiet form of balance begins to take shape. The relationship continues to exist, but the energy that keeps it standing comes mostly from one side. Carl Jung argued that the human psyche cannot maintain this kind of imbalance indefinitely. When someone spends too long living in a role where they are constantly holding and carrying for others, a shift begins to form deep inside the inner life. From that perspective, an empath's departure is not simply a relationship decision. It often signals a psychological turning point, where a person begins to examine the role they have carried for too long and asks a very direct question. If I continue living this way, what will it eventually cost me? This video explores that inner process because many people only recognize it after things have already reached a point where there is no way back. Part 1. When the lonely empath leaves without a word. An empath's decision to leave is rarely born from a single dramatic event. It is more like a fine crack forming inside a block of stone. At first, no one can see it. From the outside, everything still holds its old shape. But deep within the structure, pressure has already begun to accumulate. Each time their feelings are brushed aside, each time their intuition is dismissed, each time they quietly adjust themselves just to keep the atmosphere from becoming tense, that crack grows a little longer. To outsiders, these moments look like ordinary situations in everyday life. But for an empath, these small details carry a different weight, because they do not only hear the words being spoken, they also sense the emotional tone that stands behind those words. People with deep empathy usually live with a very sensitive perceptual system. They are like someone standing in a dark room who can still notice the smallest shift in light, a glance that turns away too quickly, a response that no longer carries the same attention as before, a different kind of silence after a conversation ends. These signals are often too subtle for others to notice, but to them, they resemble faint ripples on the surface of water that reveal the current underneath has already changed direction. What makes this process stretch over such a long time is that empaths rarely react immediately. Their first instinct is to understand. They try to place themselves in the other person's position. They search for reasons behind the behavior. They tell themselves that perhaps the other person is tired, busy, or dealing with something difficult. This response creates a very familiar loop. They observe, they explain, and then they continue maintaining the relationship as it was. To other people, it appears that everything is still fine, but in the deeper layers of the psyche, a very precise process of recording is taking place. Jung believed that the human unconscious works like a system that registers repeating patterns in life. It does not place much importance on the rational explanations that the conscious mind produces. What it observes instead is the real rhythm of experience, what keeps repeating, what never truly changes, and what continuously moves against the deeper needs of the person. Jung once wrote, The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The sentence points to something essential. Every psyche has its own limit. When someone repeatedly steps beyond that limit in order to keep peace for others, the unconscious begins to accumulate a very particular kind of tension. At this stage, the principle of enantiodromia begins to appear. Jung used this concept to describe the natural reversal of psychological energy when one extreme is maintained for too long. If a pendulum is held on one side for an extended time, the tension stored in it will eventually pull it toward the opposite side. For an empath, the pole they often maintain for years is the pole of patience, understanding, and the effort to preserve connection. They are the one who keeps moving toward the other person, yet the very energy required to sustain that position for so long gradually builds a counterforce inside them. The final moment is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it is so small that if it were retold, others would struggle to understand why it mattered. It might simply be a familiar sentence repeated one more time. It might be an indifferent response when they are trying to share something serious. But inside the mind of an empath, that moment feels like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place. All the scattered fragments from the past suddenly connect into a clear structure. At that point, what appears is not an emotional explosion. It feels more like a very cold and very precise realization. They see the pattern of the relationship the way someone finally sees the full map of a landscape they had previously walked through in fragments. And once that map becomes visible, they see something else as well. The road ahead is not actually changing. For empaths who live rather solitary inner lives, this realization usually unfolds entirely within them. They often have very few people with whom they can speak about these small observations. Because of that, the whole process of accumulation happens quietly inside their own psyche. When the final conclusion forms, it is no longer a passing thought. It feels more like a door inside the psyche gently closing, almost silently, but with complete finality. And when that door closes, the first thing that disappears is not love. What disappears is the belief that the relationship can still become a safe place for their inner world. Once that foundational belief fades, another series of psychological shifts begins to unfold inside the empath. This is why their departure often feels sudden and confusing to others. But what is actually happening within them runs far deeper than a simple decision to leave. Part 2. The silent cracks that lead to the final cut. The real fractures in this kind of relationship rarely come from dramatic events. They develop in the way psychological energy flows between two people. In many relationships, that energy does not move in two directions. It functions more like a system where one person continuously pours water into a reservoir, while the other simply uses that water to keep their own emotional state stable. The empath is usually that source of water. They provide attention, explanations, patience, and countless moments of self-adjustment in order to keep the connection from collapsing. From the outside, this often looks like devotion, but within the deeper structure of the psyche, it resembles a constant supply of energy to a system that cannot regulate itself. Carl Jung did not view relationships merely through surface behavior. He saw them as energetic structures where the unconscious elements of two psyches begin interacting with one another. In many cases, a person who has not integrated their own shadow will unconsciously search for a place to place it outside themselves. The empath, with their high capacity to contain emotions and their tendency to understand others, easily becomes that receiving surface. Jung once described this mechanism with striking clarity. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. When someone is not ready to confront the anxiety, shame, or inner emptiness within them, they often find ways to keep those elements outside themselves. The relationship then becomes the most convenient place for that to happen. In reality, this rarely unfolds in an obvious way. It resembles an ecosystem that has lost its balance. One person keeps creating small disturbances, sometimes drawing close, sometimes pulling away, sometimes seeking connection, then suddenly becoming distant again. These shifts force the empath to constantly adjust. They think more, analyze more, and try harder to understand. Each time they do this, they invest more psychological energy into the relationship. From a Jungian perspective, wherever a person invests their psychic libido, that place gradually becomes the center of their inner life. This is the point many empaths fail to recognize for a very long time. They believe they are simply trying to preserve a relationship. In reality, they are sustaining a psychological structure that depends on their attention to survive. That structure is similar to a fire. By itself, it does not contain enough fuel to burn for long. But every time the empath tries to understand a little more, forgive a little more, or explain a little more, they are placing another piece of wood onto that fire. A woman named Claire once described her past relationship in a way that reveals this pattern clearly. Claire was highly sensitive to the emotions of others. She could detect even the slightest change in someone's tone of voice. Her partner often moved through unstable phases. At times, he was deeply attentive, and at other times, he became completely cold. Claire was always the one trying to explain those shifts. She told her friends that he carried many old wounds and simply needed more time. Years later, she realized what had actually happened. The relationship functioned like a system of projection. The unintegrated parts within him were repeatedly placed into the relationship, while she became the surface that absorbed them. Jung referred to this process as shadow projection, where one psyche uses another psyche to hold what it cannot yet face within itself. Within structures like this, the boundary between two people gradually becomes blurred. Jung used the term participation mystique to describe this state. It resembles two rivers merging until it becomes difficult to tell where one current begins and the other ends. The empath slowly begins to feel that maintaining the emotional stability of the relationship is naturally their responsibility. They are no longer certain which emotions belong to them and which belong to the other person. They only know that if they stop trying, the entire system might collapse. The danger of this cycle is not only the repeated emotional wounds, it also retrains the empath's entire emotional nervous system. Over time, they become used to constantly reading the emotional atmosphere in a room. They grow accustomed to predicting the other person's reactions and adjusting themselves before even speaking. They begin living in a continuous state of emotional vigilance without realizing that this is not the natural condition of a healthy relationship. In the logic of the psyche, wherever we repeatedly invest attention, anticipation, and emotional energy, that place gradually occupies a large portion of our inner life. This is why a relationship like this does not only create pain, it slowly consumes the empath's living energy, much like a climbing vine that wraps itself around a large tree and gradually draws its sap. And eventually, a realization begins to emerge that is difficult to avoid. If this entire structure survives on my energy, what would happen if I simply stopped providing it? Part 3. Why the empath carries the entire relationship. The question we just raised often marks a very deep movement in the psyche that Carl Jung described through the distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is the familiar part of the mind, the part that constantly tries to keep the story of our life looking reasonable and coherent. It is like a manager trying to keep order in a room by rearranging the furniture, explaining everything, and reassuring everyone that the situation is still under control. But the self is not the manager of that room. The self is more like the entire structure of the house itself. It can sense when the foundation begins to tilt, when the wooden beams inside the walls have started to rot, even when the surface of the walls is still freshly painted. In many relationships that slowly drain an empath, the ego is the part that keeps finding reasons to stay. It says that the other person is acting this way because they are hurting. It reminds us that we understand them better than anyone else, so we should be patient a little longer. The ego is very skilled at creating stories that make endurance feel meaningful, but the self does not operate through stories. The self looks at the actual flow of energy that is taking place. It sees that one person is continuously pouring their life force into a vessel that has no bottom. Jung once wrote very directly about this process. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When a person begins to look directly at the real darkness within a relationship, the explanations of the ego slowly lose their weight. This difference can be imagined through a simple image. The ego is like someone living in an old house who paints over the walls every time a crack appears. From the outside, the house still looks fine, but the self is like the structure beneath the foundation. It hears bricks breaking inside the walls, sees water seeping into the base of the building, and understands that the problem is no longer about the paint. For empaths, this difference becomes especially clear. Their persona is often built around the image of being the understanding one, the one who can endure, the one who keeps things from falling apart. That persona can look like a very beautiful mask, but when it is worn for too long, the mask slowly turns into a sealed room. A woman named Rebecca once described that it took her almost 10 years to understand this. Rebecca is the kind of person who makes everyone feel heard the moment they speak with her. In her relationship, she was always the one explaining things, calming tensions, and keeping everything moving forward. She once said that for years she felt like an emotional climate control system for the two of them. When the other person became unstable, she adjusted. When the emotional atmosphere grew cold, she warmed it again. Later, she realized that what exhausted her was not only the other person's behavior, but the fact that she had completely identified with her empath persona. She believed that this was her true nature, while her self was quietly trapped behind that mask. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the persona stops being a tool for relating to the world and becomes a psychological prison. Within the logic of the psyche, the self always tends toward restoring wholeness. It functions almost like an ecosystem that knows how to rebalance itself. When a river is blocked for too long, the water eventually finds another path to flow. When a part of the inner life is forced to serve a role for too long, the self begins to dismantle the structure that is holding it there. This is why the day an empath stops responding, stops explaining, or stops returning is not necessarily the day they suddenly changed. More often, it is simply the day the decision of the self finally reaches the surface of behavior. The real shift began long before that moment. This is also why the withdrawal of an empath often feels so absolute. When the ego makes a decision, it usually leaves many doors open. But when the self intervenes, its aim is not to keep the relationship alive. Its aim is to protect the integrity of the psyche. In many cases, Withdrawing all emotional energy from a bond becomes the only way to do that. And here lies the paradox. The moment an empath stops feeding the relationship, the structure that depended on their energy often collapses very quickly. What is rarely spoken about is what happens after stepping out of that structure. The first feeling is not always relief. Many empaths enter a strange psychological territory where freedom is mixed with guilt and self-doubt. That paradox is exactly what leads into the next part of this story. Before we move further, if you have ever felt that you were the one who had to hold everything together in a relationship, feel free to share your experience in the comments. Sometimes simply naming what we have truly lived through is the first step that allows the psyche to begin restoring its balance. Part 4. When the inner self activates self-protection. When an empath truly cuts ties with a relationship, what unsettles them is not simply missing the other person in the usual sense. The deeper feeling is often closer to a kind of inner vacancy, as if a space has suddenly opened within them. For many years, part of their identity had been organized around keeping that relationship alive. They were the one who kept the emotional rhythm steady, the one who corrected small misalignments, the one who absorbed the waves of the other person's moods so the boat would not capsize. When the relationship disappears, it is not only a person who leaves their life. A familiar role disappears at the same time. The psyche must suddenly face a stretch of inner space that used to be constantly filled by managing and holding the emotions of someone else. Carl Jung described a structure in the psyche called the persona. The persona is like a social mask that helps us function within relationships. But this mask does not remain only on the surface. If worn long enough, it begins to seep into the way we understand ourselves. For many empaths, their persona forms around the image of being the one who understands, the one who can endure, the one who keeps harmony. At first, this is simply a pattern of behavior. Over time, however, the persona becomes something like an invisible frame surrounding their inner life. They grow used to walking into any room and automatically reading the emotional atmosphere, sensing the smallest tensions, and instinctively trying to soften them. One way to picture the empath persona is as a system of breakwaters built along a coastline. For years, it absorbs the waves of emotion that arrive from the outside, so the land behind it can remain calm. But if those breakwaters must take wave after wave for too long, the structure itself begins to fracture. And when the relationship ends, the breakwater suddenly has no clear function anymore. The sea may have pulled back, yet the structure is still trembling from the pressure it has endured for years. A woman named Elena once described this experience with striking honesty. Elena had always been seen as the emotional stabilizer in her relationships. For years, she lived with the sense that she could read what others could not say out loud. She believed this was the gift of empathy. But when her 8-year relationship ended, she entered a strangely disorienting state. It was not only that she missed the person, she felt as if a familiar part of herself had suddenly lost its place. What she once called her nature, the part of her that always understood and carried the emotional weight, turned out largely to be a persona. It was a mask she had worn for far too long. Jung pointed directly to this when he wrote, "The persona is what one is not, but what oneself as well as others think one is." When that mask suddenly loses the stage on which it once performed, the psyche often enters an uncomfortable transition. Many empaths misunderstand this moment. They assume the emptiness means they should go back. But what is actually happening is closer to an internal restructuring. The old persona is dissolving while a new structure has not yet formed. The in-between state resembles a snake shedding its skin. The old layer has cracked open, yet the new skin underneath is still extremely sensitive. Even the smallest movement can feel unsettling. The guilt that appears during this phase also has a very clear origin. For many years, an empath's sense of worth has been tied to endurance and to keeping others emotionally stable. Because of this, when they finally draw a boundary or leave, the old unconscious system reacts as if something morally wrong has occurred. It behaves like a warning system that was programmed long ago. Jung would describe this as the activity of a moral complex, where kindness and self-sacrifice have fused with personal identity. When that complex is challenged, the psyche produces guilt, even if the action itself is necessary for self-protection. Jung once said something deeply revealing about this stage of psychological growth. No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The sentence points to a simple truth. Psychological maturation rarely begins with comfort. When an old structure collapses, the first sensation is rarely peace. It is more like stepping out of a cramped, dark room after living there for years. The air outside is fresher, yet the sudden light makes the eyes ache for a while. At the same time, another process quietly begins inside the psyche. When the empath stops pouring emotional energy into the other person, that energy begins to return. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection. For years, their attention, hope, and efforts to repair had flowed outward. Once that flow stops, psychic energy slowly moves back toward its own center. Yet the early phase of this return is not easy. For the first time in a long time, the empath must face themselves without the familiar role that once shielded them. This is precisely where the deeper center of the psyche begins to act as it was always meant to protect its own integrity. The self does not pursue immediate comfort. It seeks inner truth, and sometimes reaching that truth requires crossing a long, empty stretch between the person someone used to be and the person they are becoming. If an empath returns to the relationship during this period, it is often not because of love alone. More often they return because the old mask feels familiar. Wearing it again quiets the uncertainty for a while. But if they remain steady and allow themselves to stay within that empty space just a little longer, something different begins to unfold. The psychological energy that had been drained for years gradually returns to them. And when that energy truly returns, a decisive shift begins to form in the inner life of an empath. In the next part, we will look closely at that moment, when withdrawal is no longer only a painful reaction, but the first movement of a deeper transformation within the psyche. Part 5. Guilt, emptiness, and the collapse of the old role. The first change an empath often notices after leaving a relationship that has been draining them does not appear in surface emotions. It appears in the climate of the mind itself. Before, their inner life was like a room with its windows constantly open to someone else's storm. Every small shift in the other person's mood blew straight into that room. They had to guess, adjust, and constantly regulate the atmosphere so it would not become too cold or too tense. When that connection finally ends, the storm is no longer blowing directly inside. What appears afterward is not excitement or relief. It feels more like the stillness of a forest after many years of harsh wind. The branches are still trembling, but for the first time the ground beneath them has a chance to settle. Before that moment, their perceptive system often functioned like a radar station that never stopped scanning the sky. Every small signal from the other person was analyzed. A message that was shorter than usual, a pause in conversation, a slightly distant look in the eyes. All of these details were fed into long chains of thought, trying to understand what might be happening. They were not doing this because they enjoyed complicating life. They were doing it because their psyche had grown accustomed to the task of stabilizing the relationship. But maintaining a radar system like this consumes an enormous amount of psychic energy. Carl Jung often emphasized that psychic energy, what he broadly called libido, always flows toward whatever captures the strongest attention of the psyche. When a relationship constantly triggers worry, hope, interpretation, and adjustment, it becomes a center that pulls energy toward itself. The situation can be imagined like a river that has been redirected for many years. Instead of flowing through its natural valley, the water is forced into an artificial channel that keeps an unstable machine running. The river still flows, but the land around it slowly dries out because the water no longer returns to nourish the soil. When the current is finally allowed to return to its natural bed, the landscape does not immediately turn green again, but the underground springs begin to wake up. At this stage, many empaths experience a deeper form of introversion than usual. From the outside, it may look like withdrawal, but through a Jungian lens, this is often a natural movement of healing within the psyche. After a long period of being pulled into another person's emotional orbit, the mind needs to return to its own center. Jung once wrote a line that captures this movement clearly. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Turning inward here is not an escape from the world. It is more like a watchmaker opening a clock and examining the entire mechanism inside after years of running out of rhythm. In this quiet, many empaths begin to notice something both painful and liberating. They realize that parts of themselves have been left behind for a long time. There were interests that once made them feel alive, but disappeared during the years they spent stabilizing someone else. There were thoughts that had been pushed down because they might have made the other person uncomfortable. There were emotions that had to shrink so the relationship would not shake. A woman named Margaret once described this experience after ending a relationship that lasted nearly a decade. The thing that surprised her most was the silence inside her own mind. For years, her thoughts had felt like a control room filled with glowing panels, where every signal from the other person had to be monitored. When the relationship ended, many of those lights suddenly went out. At first, she thought she had become cold. But what was actually happening was a reclaiming of psychic energy. The attention that had been stretched outward for years was beginning to return to the center of her psyche. What follows does not feel like the kind of happiness people imagine when they think about freedom. It resembles a lake that has been stirred for many years. When the movement finally stops, the water does not become clear immediately, but slowly, layers of sediment begin to settle, and when the surface becomes still enough, it can finally reflect the sky above it. The important point is that when psychic energy begins to return in this way, empaths often feel the difference between two states of living with unusual clarity. One state requires them to constantly adjust themselves in order to hold together an unstable structure. The other allows their energy to remain within their own inner life. Over time, this difference changes how their psyche looks back at the old relationship. And when that change becomes deep enough, the question is no longer, should I go back? The real question becomes something else entirely. Why returning to a structure that once drained the life out of them now feels almost impossible? The answer lies in a deeper shift within Jungian psychology that we will explore in the next part, where the empath's departure is no longer just a reaction to pain, but the beginning of a movement toward individuation. Part 6: Reclaiming Energy and Crossing the Point of No Return. When an empath reaches the point of no return, what truly changes is not memory, but the current of psychic vitality attached to that memory. The other person still exists in their mind, much like an old city they once lived in for many years. They still remember the streets, the familiar corners, the moments that once carried meaning. But that city is no longer where they live. It becomes a location on the map of memory, rather than the center of their present life. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when psychic energy, libido in its broader sense, is withdrawn from an old symbol. The symbol remains, but the living bond between the self and that symbol has been loosened. Before this process completes, the other person usually holds a very large place in the empath's inner structure. They are not merely another human being. They become a center of meaning. Hopes, vigilance, attempts to repair, and long periods of waiting all circle around them. The empath's psyche resembles a sky where a very heavy planet pulls the orbits of everything around it. When that planet loses its gravitational force, the orbits begin to change. The sky does not disappear, but its structure rearranges itself. Carl Jung saw this moment as part of individuation, the process through which a person stops building their identity around the role they play in someone else's life and begins building it around an honest relationship with their deepest self. Jung wrote a powerful line about this. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But in order to become who we truly are, the psyche often has to dismantle structures where we once placed too much meaning on being needed. For empaths, this becomes particularly visible. For many years, their compassion flows like a river without banks. It runs toward every dry place, every cracked landscape of human emotion. They do not do this because they are weak. They do it because their perceptive system is very strong. But a river without banks eventually floods its own fields. When individuation begins, that river does not disappear. It simply begins to grow banks. At this stage, the empath's compassion does not grow weaker. It simply no longer flows without condition. It becomes placed under a conscious order. Understanding remains, but it no longer means opening the gates of the inner world to everything that enters. This shift connects directly to an important concept in Jungian psychology: shadow integration. Many people think the shadow is only the dark part of the human psyche, but in many cases, the shadow also contains abilities we were taught to suppress in order to be good. For an empath, part of the shadow often includes the ability to say no, the ability to stop giving energy, and the ability to withdraw without feeling that they are betraying their kindness. When these capacities are integrated, a person becomes more whole. They are no longer only gentle. They are also someone who can protect the structure of their inner world. This transformation can be pictured in a simple image. The empath's inner garden once resembled an open piece of land with no gate. Anyone passing by could walk in. A thirsty person could draw water from the well. Someone tired could sit under the shade of a tree. Someone carrying chaos could set it down there. The garden remained green, but the soil slowly became disturbed and the roots began to weaken. After the transformation, the garden is still green. Water still flows, trees still grow, birds still pass overhead. But now, there is a gate. There are boundaries. And the one who holds the key is no longer anyone else, but the owner of the garden. This is the point where several false identifications collapse. In the past, the empath may have identified themselves as the peacemaker, the one who saves relationships, the one who can endure more than others. But in the process of individuation, those identities are dismantled. The ego no longer serves the compulsion to carry everything. It begins to serve the self, the deeper center of the psyche. That is why when an empath reaches the point of no return, their silence is often misunderstood. The other person may think they have become cold, calculating, or determined to prove something. But that silence is closer to what happens when a house finally rebuilds its foundation after years of leaning. Once the foundation has been reset, the entire structure cannot return to the old position. And the strange paradox is that this often happens precisely when the other person begins trying to return. Not because the empath changed too quickly, but because the old system has suddenly lost the place where it used to deposit its shadow. Part 7. The empath's final silence and the path of individuation. But when the empath disappears completely, that side room is no longer there. What once could be placed off to the side is now forced to remain in the center of their inner house. Jung understood this phenomenon through the lens of the shadow. The shadow is not merely the dark side of a person. It contains everything that has not yet been recognized, not yet integrated, and therefore constantly seeks expression through relationships. When someone is not ready to face those parts within themselves, they often place them unconsciously onto another person. Jung once wrote very directly, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But he also understood something else just as clearly. Most people will not choose that path as long as there is an easier escape. In many relationships like this, the empath becomes that escape. They function almost like a mirror that can speak. The other person can see their own emotions reflected through the empath's reactions. Without having to look too deeply at themselves, they can release their anger, voice their frustrations, or search for comfort. And the empath, with their heightened sensitivity, often tries to understand these expressions rather than resist them. As a result, within the unconscious structure of the relationship, the empath becomes a surface that absorbs the other person's unintegrated parts. When the empath withdraws, what disappears is not only the person who used to be there. What disappears is the emotional regulation system the other person had grown accustomed to relying on. The emptiness they experience afterward is often mistaken for longing, but in many cases, it is the confusion of a psyche that has suddenly lost a familiar mechanism for releasing pressure. This is why they return. Yet that return rarely takes the form of a clear awakening. It usually appears in ways that are difficult to recognize. A message that seems nostalgic, as if it simply wants to remember the past. A vague apology that never truly touches the core of the problem. A sudden crisis that leads them to say they need the empath. Sometimes it even appears as anger, a way of pulling the empath back into the familiar cycle of emotional reaction. In the logic of unconscious psychological cycles, the content of the response is not what matters most. What matters is whether a response occurs at all, because any response proves that the door has not fully closed. If the empath replies, even to explain or to end the conversation, the old system can still be reactivated. But when the empath truly becomes silent, something very different happens. That silence is not a strategy. It is the result of a deep restructuring within the psyche. Once the self has withdrawn its energy from a relationship, the deeper core of the person no longer cooperates with returning to the old structure. At that point, silence resembles a stone door that has finally been set into place, not to oppose anyone, but to protect the architecture of the entire house. This shift can also be understood through another image. In the past, whenever darkness rose within the other person, The empath functioned like a cellar, where those burdens could be carried down and locked away. They did not have to face those contents every day. But when that cellar disappears, everything must remain in the living room of their inner life. There is nowhere left to hide it. For Jung, the moment a person is forced to confront their own shadow is a crucial threshold. Yet it is also a threshold many people avoid. That is why when the empath disappears, the other person often experiences confusion and instability before any genuine growth begins. Some individuals will eventually turn inward and examine themselves, but many others simply attempt to rebuild the old system. This also explains why the empath's silence is so often misunderstood. The other person may believe they have become cold, cruel, or intentionally hurtful, but in many cases, that silence is simply the sign of a psyche that has passed through a point of transformation. That is why the empath's final silence is not a cold ending. It is the signal that the process of individuation has truly begun. The person is no longer living to maintain structures that drain their life energy. They begin living from the center of their own being, and this often comes with a very particular kind of solitude. Not the loneliness of loss, but the quiet that appears when someone finally stands inside their own inner life, without needing to become a mirror for anyone else's darkness. For many years, empaths often believed that their role was to keep everything from falling apart. They thought that if they understood deeply enough, endured long enough, or loved strongly enough, things would eventually become better. But when real psychological maturation begins, they start to see something different. No one can live out another person's shadow for them, and no one can truly grow if there is always someone standing nearby, ready to absorb the chaos on their behalf. Carl Jung called this journey individuation. It is the moment when a person stops living according to the roles they have grown accustomed to carrying and begins to live according to the deeper structure of their own being. This path is not always comfortable. It often comes with long periods of quiet, with moments of honest self-reflection, and with learning how to set boundaries that they may never have imagined before. Yet it is within this quiet that the psyche slowly begins to recover its balance. And when someone has walked far enough along this path, they no longer feel the need to return to the structures that once caused them to lose themselves. If this video helped you see a part of your own inner story more clearly, consider leaving a like to support the channel. And if you would like to continue exploring the deeper layers of the human psyche through the lens of Carl Jung, subscribe so you won't miss the next videos.